There is a particular stillness that falls over a courtroom when a stranger raises his right hand and swears to tell a judge everything he knows about your life. Not what he assumes. Not what he suspects. Everything he knows. I sat with my hands folded on the table, watching a man I had never spoken to, never shaken hands with, never once noticed across a parking lot, prepare to describe my mornings, my habits, words I'd said to people I loved in rooms I believed were private. I didn't know how long he'd been watching. I only knew it had been a while. My name is Mark Halloway. That spring I was 44, living in Columbus, Ohio, running Halloway Precision Machine, the shop my father opened in 1987 with one lathe and a bank loan he spent 11 years paying down. I grew up under fluorescent lights and the smell of cutting oil, learned to read a micrometer before I learned to drive, and took over the business in 2009 when my father's hands gave out. I am not, by temperament, a man who gets caught off guard. I check tolerances to the thousandth of an inch. I read every contract twice. Friends called me steady, sometimes teasing me for it. My daughter Ellie liked to say I planned grocery lists like blueprints. That steadiness carried me through 22 years without one lawsuit. It was about to be tested by a man whose name I wouldn't learn until he was under oath. Denise and I married on June 14, 2008, at the Franklin County Courthouse, on a Tuesday, because neither of us wanted a production and both of us wanted to get back to work by Thursday. She was a dental hygienist then, sharp and funny in a way that caught me off guard the first time we met, at a supplier's holiday party where she'd wandered in with a friend and stayed talking to me for 2 hours about nothing in particular. We had Ellie in 2010. For the first several years, the marriage felt like most marriages feel from the inside, ordinary, occasionally difficult, mostly good, built on small routines neither of us examined too closely. The shop, meanwhile, had grown past anything my father imagined when he poured that first concrete slab. By 2023, Halloway Precision Machine held contracts with 2 aerospace suppliers and employed 19 people, and an accountant valued the business, land included, at $2.3 million. I still had the original 1987 lease framed in my office. My father's signature faded to the color of weak tea. Denise had never worked there, never wanted to, and I respected that. She built her own career, eventually managing a dental practice on the east side that she was proud of in a quiet, unshowy way I'd always liked about her. We kept mostly separate financial lives inside a shared household, which seemed, at the time, like a reasonable arrangement between 2 adults who trusted each other and didn't need to check. I want to be clear about something because it matters for what came later. I was not a suspicious husband. I did not check her phone. I did not track her calendar. When she started coming home late from what she called practice management seminars in the fall of 2022, I believed her because I had no evidence and, frankly, no instinct telling me I needed any. My father used to say a man who watches his wife instead of trusting her has already lost the thing he's watching for. I held on to that longer than I probably should have, and for a long time it served me well. Our 15th anniversary that June was, by any outside measure, a happy one. A dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, her hand resting on mine across the table exactly like it always had, nothing in her face suggesting anything had shifted underneath it. What I did notice, without thinking much of it, was a gray sedan that seemed to idle near our street more often than made sense for a quiet cul-de-sac. I noticed it the way you notice a stray detail in a familiar photograph. Present, slightly wrong, easy to set aside. Once, in February 2023, I even found a business card wedged behind the visor of Denise's car while helping her scrape ice off the windshield, plain white, no logo, just a name and a phone number, and I remember thinking it was probably a contractor's card and putting it back without a second thought. I noticed these things the way a man notices weather, present, unremarked upon, gone by the next morning. I set the sedan aside, too, for the better part of a year. That was the first mistake. It would not be the last thing I set aside without asking why, and looking back, I think that was exactly what she was counting on. The divorce filing itself, in March 2024, was almost gentle by comparison to what followed. Denise cited irreconcilable differences. I didn't contest the characterization, even though privately I suspected the differences had names and dates I hadn't yet been given. We were 4 months into proceedings, mostly settled on custody schedules and asset division, when the hearing on July 9th took a turn I had not remotely prepared for. Denise's attorney, a sharp litigator named Patricia Kwan, rose and said, "Your Honor, we'd like to call our next witness, Daniel Voss." I turned toward the courtroom door, expecting someone from Denise's family, maybe a coworker from the practice. Instead, a stranger in a gray suit walked forward, was sworn in, and sat down across from me for the first time in my life. He began describing my Tuesday morning routine, the coffee shop on 3rd Street, the exact minute I usually left the house, a phone call he claimed I'd made from my truck in April, quoting words he attributed to me almost verbatim, down to a joke I'd made about a supplier's late shipment. He testified, calm as a man reading a grocery list, that he had observed me on 11 separate occasions between May 2023 and June 2024. I felt my stomach fold in on itself, not from guilt, but from the specific surgical wrongness of hearing a stranger narrate my own life back to me in a public room, in front of a judge, in front of Denise, whose face I could not read at all. My attorney, Grace Ellery, put a hand flat on the table beside mine, a signal not to speak yet. Denise sat perfectly still beside Patricia Kwan, hands folded, watching me the way you'd watch a stranger across a waiting room, not a man you'd shared a bed with for 16 years. I noticed, even in that moment, that her stillness looked practiced, rehearsed somewhere private, and I would spend a long time afterward wondering exactly how long she had been perfecting it in front of a mirror I never saw. Grace requested a 15-minute recess before Voss could be cross-examined, and we stepped into a narrow conference room that smelled like old carpet and coffee left too long on a burner. "Do you know that man?" she asked, and I told her the truth. I didn't, not by name, not by face. But saying it out loud made something click into place. "There was a car," I said. "A gray sedan. Near the house. For most of last year." Grace didn't react the way I expected. She wrote it down, calm, and asked whether I'd ever mentioned it to anyone. I hadn't. I told her about the business card, too, the one behind the visor, plain white, a name and number I hadn't bothered to remember. "Do you still have it?" she asked. I didn't know. I told her I'd look. Grace had spent 18 years doing family law in Franklin County, and she had a particular calm that I came to recognize as her working mode, unhurried, almost bored-sounding, right up until she wasn't. "Before we go back in," she said, "I want to know exactly who Daniel Voss is licensed through, who's paying him, and how long this has been going on. If any of that doesn't hold up, it changes what his testimony is worth." She didn't promise me anything. She didn't tell me what she suspected about Denise, though I could tell, from the careful way she avoided speculating out loud, that she suspected plenty. What she gave me instead was homework, of a kind. "Go home," she said, "and look through anything with dates on it, old calendars, credit card statements, anything that might tell us when this started. Don't confront Denise. Don't mention Voss's name to anyone outside this room. Let the paperwork do the talking, because paperwork, unlike people, doesn't get nervous under questioning." I drove home replaying 11 months of a gray sedan I'd trained myself not to see, wondering what else I'd trained myself not to see along with it. Grace called that evening to say she'd already reached a licensing investigator she trusted, a woman named Feldman who could pull records faster through proper channels than either of us could alone. It wasn't a confrontation yet. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a plan with edges I couldn't fully make out, and an instruction to sit still, say nothing, and let it build quietly in the weeks that followed. The way she said the best cases were always built, and the worst ones were the ones rushed out of anger. The next 6 weeks moved on 2 tracks at once, and I spent most of them pretending only one existed. On the surface, Denise and I were a couple finishing an amicable divorce. We split Ellie's school pickups without argument, sat 2 seats apart at her father's 80th birthday in early August, and Denise gave a toast that night about family loyalty that made her sister cry. I watched her do it, glass raised, voice warm, and felt something cold settle in my chest, because I already knew, by then, that the version of her performing devotion in that room was not the only version that existed. Underneath, Grace's investigator, Feldman, was working faster than I expected. On July 22nd, she confirmed that Daniel Voss held no private investigator license in the state of Ohio, not currently, not ever, and not under any prior name she could locate. Whatever he wasn't what he'd sworn under oath to be. On July 30th, Feldman traced a pattern of payments from a joint expense account Denise had quietly opened in March 2022, one I'd never once been told about, totaling $42,000 over 14 months, paid out in amounts just under the threshold that would have triggered a bank's automatic reporting flag. Round numbers, mostly. Suspiciously careful ones, deposited on the 3rd of each month like a salary. Then came the phone records, obtained properly, through subpoena, nothing improvised, nothing that could later be challenged as tainted. Calls between Denise's cell and a number registered to Voss, dozens of them, many after 11 at night, several running past 40 minutes at a stretch. I sat in Grace's office on August 6th looking at a printed spreadsheet of another man's calls to my wife and felt, oddly, less rage than a kind of quiet recalibration, like watching a building you'd trusted for years reveal, plank by plank, that it had never been load-bearing the way you assumed. I didn't confront her. That was the hardest part. Some nights, sitting across from her at a co-parenting dinner in mid-August, watching her laugh at something Ellie said, knowing what I knew, saying nothing. Grace had been clear any premature move could tip Denise into destroying records or coaching Voss further, and everything we had was stronger sealed than spoken. So I held it. I signed forms. I picked Ellie up on schedule, every Tuesday and Thursday at 4:15, the same as always. I let Denise believe, for 5 more weeks, that I still didn't know what she'd quietly built behind my back, and I got good, in that stretch, at a particular kind of stillness I hadn't known I had in me. There was a moment, on August 19th, when Denise asked me over coffee, casually, almost lightly, whether I'd noticed anything strange lately, whether I felt like I was being watched. I said no. I said it evenly, without a flicker, and watched her exhale, satisfied, unaware that the question itself told me more than any answer I could have given her. It was the closest she came to checking her own work. Ellie noticed things too, in her own way, though she didn't know what she was noticing. On September 2nd, she mentioned offhand that her mother had taken a call in the driveway, again, late, after Ellie was supposed to be asleep, and that her mother's voice had gone quiet and clipped the way it did when she didn't want to be overheard. I filed that detail away the same way I'd filed away the sedan and the business card, carefully, without reaction, the way Grace had trained me to hold everything until it could be used properly instead of spent in anger. There was a strange discipline to it, learning to receive information like that without letting my face give anything back. Grace and I met again on September 9th to walk through what we had in full: the unlicensed investigator, the hidden account, the 14 months of payments, the late-night calls, the recovered text. Laid out together on her conference table, it stopped looking like scattered suspicion and started looking like a timeline. A deliberate one, built with the same patience I'd once assumed only I possessed. "She's good," Grace said, not admiringly, just factually, the way you describe a well-machined part before explaining exactly where its tolerance had failed. But good isn't the same as careful, and she wasn't careful with the money. By September, Feldman had one more piece, an old text thread, recovered from a secondary device Denise had reported lost in a prior proceeding but never actually disposed of, in which she'd written to Voss, in June 2023, "Just get me enough to make the custody case airtight, doesn't matter how." I read that line 4 times before I could process what it meant. Not surveillance out of suspicion, but surveillance manufactured for leverage, aimed, from the beginning, at Ellie as much as at me. What I didn't know yet, sitting in Grace's office with that timeline spread across the table, was whether any of it would matter in front of a judge who hadn't seen it the way we had. An unlicensed investigator is a problem. A hidden account is a problem. But problems and proof are different animals, and Grace still hadn't told me how she planned to use what we had, or when. "Not yet," she said when I asked. "We only get one chance to make this land, and I'd rather wait for the right room than rush the wrong one." I didn't understand, that week, just how soon the right room would arrive. The right room arrived on October 3rd, when the hearing resumed and Patricia Kwan called Daniel Voss back for further testimony, clearly expecting a formality. Grace stood for cross-examination and began, almost gently, by asking Voss to state his private investigator license number for the record. He hesitated, a full 3 seconds, long enough for the judge to look up from her notes. "I operate independently," he said. Grace let the silence sit before asking whether independently meant unlicensed. He didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. The judge's expression told me everything I needed to know about how that non-answer had landed in a room built on sworn testimony. Grace moved through the payment records next. The $42,000, the 14 months, the account Denise had never disclosed in her financial affidavit, a document she'd signed under penalty of perjury back in April. Then the phone records, the late-night calls, the 40-minute stretches, laid out on the screen in a format even I could follow without help. Denise's face, which had held so steady through months of dinners and toasts and co-parenting pickups, began to change, not dramatically, not with tears, but with a tightening around the mouth, a stillness that had gone from performed to genuinely frozen in place. I had spent 16 years learning her expressions, cataloging them without meaning to the way you catalog anything familiar. I had never once seen that particular one before, and some part of me understood, watching it settle over her, that I was finally looking at something real. The final piece was the recovered text. Grace read the date and the words aloud, Denise's own instruction to Voss, the line about making the custody case airtight, whatever it took, and asked her directly, under oath, whether she recalled writing it. Denise looked at her attorney first, which told the whole room everything before she'd said a word, then answered quietly that she didn't recall the exact wording. The judge asked to see the original message displayed in full. Patricia Kwan, beside her own client, had gone very still herself, in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with realizing, in real time, exactly what her own witness had just cost her case in front of the bench. For the first time since the divorce began, I watched Denise's calm, the one that had outlasted mine for months, the one I'd sat across from at dinners and family birthdays without flinching, finally, visibly, completely break, right there, in front of her own attorney, in front of a judge, in front of a room full of people who would remember it. The judge struck Voss's testimony from the record in full and barred any evidence derived from his surveillance, calling the methods not merely unlicensed but a documented attempt to manufacture custody leverage. Denise's financial affidavit, shown to have concealed the $42,000 account, triggered a referral for further review, and the asset division that followed weighted heavily toward the discovery, awarding me the business outright and a significantly larger share of shared property than the original filing had proposed. Custody, too, shifted, not because I asked for sole custody out of spite, but because the judge found Denise's conduct directly relevant to Ellie's stability and granted me primary residential status with generous, supervised visitation on Denise's side for the first year, subject to review the following summer. What surprised me more than the ruling itself was what happened outside the courtroom, in the weeks after. Denise's sister, who had cried at that toast back in August, stopped speaking to her for the better part of that fall once the payment records became part of the public docket and made their way, inevitably, through the family. Ellie, then 14, asked me only once what Voss had actually been doing, and I told her the truth in the smallest possible dose a 14-year-old could carry, that her mother had made a choice, and the choice had consequences, and none of it was Ellie's fault to carry. She nodded like she'd already half known, the way kids often do. Denise, for her part, never once explained herself to me directly, not that fall, not since. I don't expect she ever will, and I've stopped waiting for it. I think about that first day often, the stranger raising his hand, swearing to tell the truth about a life he'd only ever watched from a distance, never actually lived. I know now what patience costs and what it buys. It cost me 5 weeks of sitting across from someone who thought she'd outmaneuvered me, saying nothing, letting paperwork do the work Rage never could have done as well or as quietly. It bought me a business my father built, a daughter's stability, and a version of the truth a judge could actually use. People ask me sometimes if I regret not confronting Denise the moment I first suspected something was wrong. I don't, not for a second. A man who reacts shows his hand too early. A man who waits gets to watch someone else's hand shown for him. In a courtroom, under oath, with a judge and a room full of witnesses watching it happen in real time. I didn't know it that first day, sitting still, hands folded, listening to a stranger describe my own life back to me like he owned it. I know it now. Some things only cost you something if you flinch first.